At the height of the Cold War, the sky stopped being empty. It became a battlefield. By the late 1950s, the great powers had learned a dangerous lesson. The next war, if it came, would not begin at the border or on the ground. It would begin at altitude, high above cities, forests and oceans, where aircraft flew faster than sound and higher than any pilot of the Second World War could have imagined. Whoever controlled that thin, cold layer of the atmosphere would control the opening minutes of a global conflict. For the Soviet Union, the threat was stark and measurable. Across the ocean, the United States possessed a vast fleet of long-range strategic bombers, capable of reaching Soviet territory. These aircraft were not designed for dogfights. They were designed to fly far, high, and fast, carrying weapons whose destructive power made traditional defense seem almost irrelevant. The question facing Soviet planners was brutally simple. How do you stop an aircraft you cannot catch? The early answers were unsatisfying. Surface-to-air missiles offered promise, but they came with limitations. Missile system could protect specific targets, cities, air bases, industrial centers, but they could not realistically shield a country spanning 11 time zones. A missile umbrella over the entire Soviet Union was a fantasy, not a strategy. That left the other option: aircraft against aircraft. Interceptor fighters became the backbone of Soviet air defense. But even here, the limits of existing technology were becoming obvious. Fighters designed in the early jet age struggled with speed ceilings, altitude limits, and endurance. Worse still, reality had already exposed their weaknesses. In the mid-1950s, American Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft began flying directly over Soviet territory. They were not fast by later standards, but they flew so high, above 20 kilometers, that Soviet interceptors simply could not reach them. These aircraft photographed missile sites, airfields, and industrial centers with near impunity. Each successful overflight was not just an intelligence victory for the United States. It was a political humiliation for the Soviet air defense system. And the U-2 was only the beginning. Military planners on both sides were already looking ahead. If slow, lightly defended reconnaissance aircraft could exploit altitude, what would happen when true high-speed machines arrived? Projects like the American XB-70 Valkyrie, a bomber intended to cruise at 3 times the speed of sound, suggested a future where bombers would outrun fighters and outrange missiles. The idea of a high-altitude, high-speed breakthrough became the dominant fear of Soviet air defense. By the end of the 1950s, a grim balance had emerged. Each side could threaten the other. Each side could retaliate, but defense lagged behind offense. As one military principle quietly asserted itself: anything you could do to your enemy could soon do to you. For the Soviet Union, geography made this imbalance especially dangerous. Defending a compact nation is one thing. Defending the world's largest country, its cities scattered thousands of kilometers apart, its borders exposed to multiple directions of attack, is another entirely. Speed and altitudes were no longer luxuries, they were necessities. Existing interceptor projects, such as the Su-15 and the Tu-128, offered partial solutions. They were capable machines for their time, but they were designed for yesterday's problems. Their performance margins left little room for the next generation of threats. Against future reconnaissance aircraft and bombers flying at extreme speeds and altitudes, they would be outmatched before they ever fired the missile. What the Soviet air defense forces needed was not an improved fighter, but a new category of aircraft altogether. The requirements issued to the Mikoyan and Gurevich Design Bureau in the mid-1950s reflected the urgency of the situation. The numbers were uncompromising. The aircraft had to reach altitudes of 20 to 25 kilometers. It had to fly at speeds between Mach 2.5 and Mach 3, approaching 3,000 kilometers per hour. It needed a powerful radar capable of detecting targets far beyond visual range, and missiles fast enough to survive a head-on interception at extreme closing speeds. But there was another constraint, often overlooked and just as important. This aircraft could not be exotic. It could not be rare. It had to be built in large numbers, maintained by ordinary Air Force units, and flown by pilots who were not test aces. It had to operate from existing airfields, integrate with ground-based radar networks, and remain on constant alert. A miracle machine that only existed in small numbers would be useless in a real war. Western projects of the same era, advanced, ambitious, and technologically dazzling, often failed precisely because they crossed that line. They were too expensive, too complex, or too fragile for sustained operational service. Soviet engineers understood the risk. Designing the most impressive aircraft on paper meant nothing if it could not stand daily duty in the harsh realities of air defense. For years, the idea of such an aircraft bordered on science fiction. The greatest obstacle was propulsion. No existing engine could operate efficiently at sustained speeds near Mach 3. The heat, the stress, and the fuel consumption pushed known technology to its limits. Without a solution to that problem, the entire concept remained theoretical. Yet, history has a way of forcing innovation. By the dawn of the 1960s, the pressure had become unbearable. The shoot-down of a U-2 by a surface-to-air missile in 1960 proved that high-altitude intruders were not invincible, but it also exposed a sobering truth. Interceptor aircraft had chased the intruder for hours without success. Missiles had saved the day, but they had done so late, over the heart of the country. Relying solely on ground defenses was not enough. The Soviet Union needed an aircraft that could climb faster than the threat, fly higher than the threat, and meet it head-on before it reached its target. An aircraft that would not merely defend airspace, but deny the very concept of high-speed penetration. That requirement would give birth to one of the most extreme machines ever to take flight, and its name would be MiG-25. If the requirements for the new interceptor sounded extreme, the reality of building it was even harsher. On paper, reaching Mach 3 was a matter of numbers. In metal, fuel, and fire, it bordered on the impossible. The first and greatest obstacle was heat. At speeds approaching 3 times the speed of sound, an aircraft does not simply cut through the air, it fights it. Friction turns the atmosphere into a furnace. Leading edges glow with heat. Skin temperatures climb beyond 250 degrees Celsius, and in some areas, even higher. Conventional aircraft aluminum, the backbone of aviation since the Second World War, loses strength long before those temperatures are reached. At Mach 3, aluminum was not just inadequate, it was dangerous. The second obstacle was propulsion. No fighter engine of the era was designed to operate efficiently in sustained supersonic flight, let alone at Mach 3. Turbojets optimized for takeoff and low-altitude combat choked on heat and airflow at extreme speeds. Turbofans, still in their infancy, offered efficiency but not raw velocity. Without a suitable engine, the aircraft could never leave the drawing board. Early attempts reflected these limitations. Experimental prototypes known as the YE-150 and the YE-152 were built as evolutionary designs, larger, faster descendants of earlier MiG fighters. They looked familiar, almost comforting, with their traditional layouts and slender noses, but flight testing quickly revealed the truth. There was no room for a powerful radar. Fuel capacity was insufficient. Stability degraded badly above Mach 2. The airframe itself had reached a ceiling that could not be pushed any higher. The lesson was clear. Refinement would not be enough. The project had to be restarted from zero. Salvation came from an unexpected direction. In the late 1950s, Soviet engineers had been developing a high-speed cruise missile known as the Tu-121. It was designed to fly at extreme altitudes and speeds close to Mach 3, very close to what the interceptor required. The missile itself never entered service. Ballistic missiles overtook it strategically, but its legacy survived in the form of its engine. That engine, known as the R-15, was enormous, brutally powerful, and utterly specialized. It performed best at high altitude and high speed. At lower speeds, it was inefficient and temperamental. Its original service life was shockingly short, measured in tens of hours, rather than hundreds. For a missile meant to fly once, this was acceptable. For a piloted aircraft, it was a nightmare. Yet there was no alternative. Engineers reworked the design extensively. Operating envelopes were widened. Thrust was moderated to preserve reliability. Service life was gradually extended, first to 50 hours, later to several hundred. By conventional standards, this was still poor, but it was enough. The engine that would power the new interceptor, designated the R-15B300, was born not as an ideal solution, but as the only solution. With propulsion secured, attention turned to the airframe, and here the design became radical. The new aircraft, now designated YE-155, abandoned traditional layouts entirely. The nose was made large and unobstructed to house a powerful radar. Air intakes were moved to the sides, freeing space and allowing careful control of airflow. The wings became thin trapezoidal surfaces with modest sweep, optimized not for agility but for stability at extreme speed. Twin vertical stabilizers replaced the traditional single fin, solving control problems that emerged near Mach 3. Every line of the aircraft reflected compromise. Aerodynamic efficiency was traded for lift at lower speeds. Structural simplicity was sacrificed to survive thermal stress. Even the engines were canted slightly upward, their thrust vectors subtly adjusted to improve high-speed stability. But the true revolution lay beneath the skin. Instead of aluminum or titanium, the majority of the aircraft was built from high-strength steel. Nearly 80% of the structure used welded steel alloys, capable of withstanding immense heat without losing integrity. Steel was heavier, but it was affordable, durable, and critically repairable. Titanium, though lighter and more heat-resistant, was prohibitively expensive and difficult to work with on a large scale. For a mass-produced interceptor, steel was the only realistic choice. This decision transformed the aircraft into something unprecedented. Empty, it weighed more than many fully armed fighters of the era. Fully loaded, its mass rivaled that of small passenger jets. Fuel filled nearly every available cavity, 6 tanks in the fuselage, 4 in the wings, and in some versions even additional tanks in the vertical stabilizers. These were not traditional fuel tanks, but sealed structural volumes, an approach that maximized capacity while introducing new risks. At Mach 3, metal expands and contracts dramatically. Seams that were tight on the ground could open in flight. Fuel leaks were common. With engines and fuel sharing close quarters, fire was a constant threat. The solution was drastic but effective. Rivets were largely abandoned in favor of welding, turning entire sections of the aircraft into rigid monolithic structures. Special high flashpoint fuel was used, and the inert nitrogen gas filled empty tank space to suppress combustion. Even the cockpit reflected the extremity of the design. The canopy was made from newly developed heat-resistant acrylic, nearly 2 centimeters thick at the front, with an integrated cooling system. At speed, it could withstand temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Celsius. Pilots were warned never to touch it in flight. It became hot enough to burn skin instantly. Despite its size and power, the aircraft remained single-seat. There was simply no room for a second crew member. To compensate, systems were heavily automated. Engine management, navigation, and even elements of interception were assisted by onboard computers and ground control. This was not a lone hunter, it was a node in a vast air defense network, guided by radar operators hundreds of kilometers away. By the early 1960s, what had once seemed impossible now stood on the edge of reality. The aircraft was heavy, complex, and unforgiving, but it promised something no interceptor before it had ever offered: dominance of speed and altitude. The MiG-25 was no longer an idea. It was becoming a machine. When the MiG-25 finally left the ground, it did not do so quietly. Its first flights in the mid-1960s were conducted under extreme secrecy. But even within the test community, it was clear that this aircraft belonged to a different category. It was not fast in the way fighters were fast. It was fast in the way artillery shells were fast, relentless, linear, and overwhelming. The first prototype of the reconnaissance variant flew in March 1964. The interceptor followed later that same year. From the beginning, flight testing revealed both the brilliance and the danger of the design. The aircraft climbed with astonishing authority, converting fuel into altitude at a rate few pilots had ever experienced. From takeoff to the edge of the stratosphere took minutes, not tens of minutes. In a real interception, that difference mattered. As testing progressed, records began to fall. In 1967, the MiG-25 flew a 1,000-kilometer closed circuit at an average speed exceeding 2,300 kilometers per hour. Soon after, that figure climbed to nearly 2,900 kilometers per hour. These were not brief dashes. They were sustained, measured flights performed by operational aircraft rather than stripped-down experimental machines. To the outside world, still unaware of the aircraft's true nature, these numbers bordered on the unbelievable. The reconnaissance version entered service in 1969 as the MiG-25R. The interceptor, more complex and demanding, followed in 1972 as the MiG-25P. Production ramped up rapidly at the Gorky aircraft plant, a facility accustomed to building light fighters like the MiG-21. Compared to what came before it, the MiG-25 was a steel leviathan. New welding techniques, new inspection methods, and entirely new manufacturing processes had to be developed just to keep pace. By the mid-1970s, dozens of aircraft were rolling off the production line each year. In total, nearly 1,200 MiG-25s would be built, a remarkable figure for such an extreme machine. This was not a prototype fleet. This was a working tool of national defense. In the air, the MiG-25's personality revealed itself quickly. Takeoff was dramatic, but not violent. Despite its immense thrust, the aircraft was heavy, and acceleration along the runway felt deliberate rather than explosive. Once airborne, however, the character changed completely. With afterburners engaged, the aircraft surged upward. Pilots described the climb as continuous, almost unreal, the ground falling away as the sky darkened from blue to deep indigo. At the altitude, the MiG-25 found its natural habitat. Its engines were most efficient not at low speed, but in sustained supersonic cruise. A speed of Mach 235, around 2,500 km per hour, was considered routine. For brief periods, pilots could push higher. Mach 265 was achievable for extended flight. The official maximum allowable speed, Mach 2.3, could be held only for minutes. Beyond that, heat became the enemy. At these velocities, the aircraft did not simply heat up. It baked. Temperatures around the canopy and leading edges approached structural limits. The cockpit grew uncomfortably warm. The transparent canopy softened under thermal stress, and prolonged exposure risked permanent deformation. The engines, too, paid a price. While capable of immense thrust, their service life diminished rapidly at extreme speeds. As a result, the MiG-25 did not fly at Mach 3 in the casual sense. It leapt there briefly, then backed away to survive. Altitude performance was equally impressive. With weapons attached, the interceptor could reach 22 kilometers. Clean, it approached 25 kilometers. In 1977, a specially prepared aircraft achieved a zoom climb to over 37 kilometers, an altitude where the curvature of the Earth is visible and the sky turns nearly black. No operational combat aircraft had ever gone higher. Yet, for all its speed and height, the MiG-25 was not agile. At Mach 2 and above, allowable maneuvering loads were limited to around 4.5 Gs. At maximum speed, even less. The aircraft handled more like a guided projectile than a traditional fighter. Turns were wide and slow. Sharp maneuvers were discouraged. In truth, they were unnecessary. The MiG-25 was never meant to dogfight. Its role was interception, fast, direct, and decisive. Ground-based radar detected the intruder. Command centers calculated the intercept point. The MiG launched, climbed hard, accelerated, and met the target head-on. There would be no chase, no turning engagement, no second chance. This philosophy shaped its armament. There was no internal cannon. At closing speeds approaching 6 times the speed of sound, guns were useless. Everything depended on missiles. The primary weapon was the R-40, a massive air-to-air missile designed specifically for this aircraft. Over 6 meters long and weighing nearly half a ton, it looked more like a small aircraft than a fighter weapon. 2 versions were carried, one with a semi-active radar seeker, the other with an infrared seeker. Fired in pairs, they gave the interceptor flexibility against different targets and countermeasures. Against an oncoming bomber or reconnaissance aircraft, the effective engagement range reached over 30 kilometers, a respectable figure for the era, especially given the extreme speeds involved. Typically, 4 such missiles were carried beneath the wings. Fully armed, the MiG-25 looked every bit as formidable as it performed. But again, context mattered. These weapons were designed for one scenario: destroying a high-speed, high-altitude target approaching Soviet airspace. Anything outside that envelope was someone else's problem. The aircraft's radar reflected this specialization. The Smerch AA system, derived from earlier interceptor designs, could detect large targets at distances of roughly 100 kilometers and track them well before missile launch. It was powerful but not refined. It struggled against targets flying low or against cluttered backgrounds. This was acceptable. The MiG-25 was built to hunt in the thin air above weather, terrain, and noise. In operation, the interceptor was never truly alone. It functioned as part of an integrated air defense system linking ground, radar, command post, missile batteries, and other aircraft. Pilots followed precise instructions, often flying missions dictated almost entirely from the ground. Independence was sacrificed for speed and coordination. From a distance, the MiG-25 looked unstoppable. From the cockpit, it demanded discipline and respect. Exceed limits and the aircraft would punish mistakes harshly. Stay within them, and it delivered performance no other interceptor of its era could match. By the early 1970s, the Soviet Union possessed something it had never had before: an aircraft capable of denying the very idea of uncontested high-altitude flight. The sky, once again, had boundaries. The first time the outside world truly saw the MiG-25, it was not in combat. It was July 1967, at the Domodedovo Air Parade near Moscow. 4 massive, unfamiliar aircraft thundered overhead, their silhouettes sharp and unmistakably different from anything previously displayed. To Soviet spectators, they were impressive. To foreign military observers, they were alarming. Almost immediately, Western intelligence services began scrambling for answers. The aircraft was assigned the NATO reporting name Foxbat, and from the moment it appeared, it generated more questions than facts. Analysts had little reliable data, only photographs, brief radar observations, and assumptions shaped by fear. What they believed they were seeing was a revolutionary multi-role fighter, one capable of Mach-free flight, extreme altitude, long range, and perhaps even high maneuverability. That interpretation was wrong, but it would take years to prove it. From the Western perspective, the timing could not have been worse. The United States had already invested heavily in high-speed reconnaissance aircraft like the A-12 and SR-71, which relied on speed and altitude for survival. If the Soviet Union now possessed a fighter capable of reaching similar regimes, the entire logic of those programs was threatened. Worse still, planners feared that such an aircraft could escort bombers, challenge air superiority, and outperform existing Western fighters across the board. Estimates grew increasingly dramatic. The MiG-25 was believed to be agile, technologically sophisticated, and produced in large numbers. It was portrayed as the ultimate expression of Soviet aerodynamic mastery. In reality, much of this was projection. But perception matters in strategy. The Foxbat shock rippled through Washington and beyond. Funding flowed. Requirements changed. The US Air Force accelerated efforts to create a new fighter that could dominate whatever the MiG-25 was presumed to be. That aircraft would eventually emerge as the F-15 Eagle, designed for speed, altitude, and above all, air superiority. Ironically, the F-15 was shaped more by the myth of the MiG-25 than by the real aircraft itself. While this drama played out in intelligence briefings and congressional hearings, the MiG-25 continued its quiet service within the Soviet air defense system. It did exactly what it had been designed to do, and nothing more. There were no grand displays, no aggressive deployments abroad. Its most important victories occurred without missiles ever leaving the rails. That changed abruptly in September 1976. On the morning of September 6th, radar stations in Japan detected an unidentified high-speed aircraft approaching the island of Hokkaido. Moments later, the aircraft descended and landed at Hakodate Airport. It was a MiG-25P interceptor, flown by Soviet pilot Viktor Belenko. The defection was a political earthquake. Within hours, Japanese and American specialists were examining one of the most secret aircraft in the Soviet inventory. For the first time, myths gave way to measurements. Panels were opened, systems were studied, metallurgy was analyzed, and the conclusions were sobering. The Foxbat was fast, extraordinarily so. It was rugged, brutally strong, and optimized for a single mission, but it was not the agile, multi-role superfighter many had imagined. Its electronics, while powerful, were largely based on vacuum tubes rather than advanced solid-state components, chosen for their resistance to heat and radiation. Its maneuverability was limited, its endurance was modest, its strengths lay in speed, altitude, and straight-line interception, not in dogfighting or flexible combat roles. The revelation caused quiet disappointment in some Western circles. The MiG-25 was no longer an enigma. It was a tool, an extreme one, but a specialized one. And crucially, it was already too late to change the course of Western aircraft development. The F-15 was nearing operational service by the time Belenko landed in Japan. Whatever influence the MiG-25 had exerted had already been absorbed. For the Soviet Union, the damage was not in reputation, but in security. Sensitive details of avionics, identification systems, and integration with ground-based air defense had been exposed. Trust in existing configurations evaporated overnight. The response was swift and extensive. Existing MiG-25P interceptors were upgraded to a new standard known as the MiG-25PD. They received improved radar with greater detection range and better performance against low-altitude targets. New missiles were introduced, including short-range weapons optimized for closer engagements. Electronic countermeasures were refined. Communication systems were revised. The aircraft became more capable, more flexible, and more resilient out of a changing threat environment. Yet, even these upgrades had limits. By the mid-1970s, the nature of the air threat itself was evolving. High-altitude penetration was no longer the dominant concern. Western doctrine increasingly emphasized low-level flight, terrain masking, and cruise missiles, targets that the MiG-25, even in improved form, was not ideally suited to counter. The Foxbat had reshaped the battlefield, but the battlefield was changing again. The Soviet Union now faced a familiar problem. The weapon that had solved yesterday's crisis was no longer enough for tomorrow's, and so, even as the MiG-25 continued to serve, its successor was already taking shape. That successor would be faster to react, more versatile, and more aware. Its name would be MiG-31. The MiG-25 never fought the war it had been built for. There was no massive formation of Mach 3 bombers rushing towards Soviet cities, no desperate head-on interceptions in the opening minutes of a nuclear conflict. The apocalypse it was designed to prevent never came. And yet, in a quiet and deeply ironic way, that was its greatest success. By the early 1970s, the MiG-25 had already begun to reshape the strategic landscape. The very existence of an interceptor capable of sustained flight at extreme altitude and speed forced a fundamental reassessment of Western air power doctrine. The concept of high-altitude, high-speed penetration, once seen as nearly unstoppable, was becoming dangerously obsolete. Nowhere was this shift more visible than in the uneasy dance between the MiG-25 and the American SR-71 Blackbird. The two aircraft were often spoken of as rivals, though, in truth, they were built for entirely different purposes. The SR-71 was a long-range strategic reconnaissance platform, optimized for endurance and intelligence collection. The MiG-25 was a point defense interceptor, designed to launch, climb, and meet intruders at precisely calculated intercept points. Comparing them directly missed the point, but their interactions mattered. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, SR-71s regularly approached Soviet airspace, skirting borders and international corridors. MiG-25s would scramble in response, climbing rapidly to meet them. Often, the two aircraft flew parallel courses, separated by invisible political lines. The Blackbird gathered electronic intelligence. The Foxbat ensured it did not cross where it should not. Neither side fired a shot. Neither needed to. On one notable occasion, in 1987, an SR-71 flying near the Baltic Sea suffered an engine malfunction, losing speed and altitude. For a brief moment, the aircraft became vulnerable. Soviet MiG-25s were launched, sensing an unprecedented opportunity. But NATO fighters quickly moved to escort the damaged Blackbird, and it escaped to safety. The incident passed without violence, but it underscored a critical reality. Speed alone was no longer enough. Vulnerability existed even at Mach 3. More importantly, the strategic logic had shifted. Western planners increasingly abandoned the idea of flying over defenses. Instead, they chose to fly under them. Low-altitude penetration, terrain-following flight, and later cruise missiles offered a new path forward. Aircraft like the F-111 embodied this approach, slipping beneath radar coverage rather than racing above it. The MiG-25 had helped kill an entire doctrine. Inside the Soviet Union, this realization drove change. While the Foxbat remained in service, it was no longer the final answer. Its limitations against low-altitude targets were clear. The solution was not incremental improvement, but evolution. That evolution became the MiG-31. Derived directly from the MiG-25's airframe philosophy, the MiG-31 retained speed and altitude, but added range, endurance, multi-target tracking, and a second crew member. It became the true guardian of vast airspace, capable of hunting cruise missiles and coordinating with other interceptors. In many ways, the MiG-31 completed the mission the MiG-25 had begun. Yet the Foxbat story did not end at Soviet borders. In the 1970s, reconnaissance variants of the MiG-25 flew missions over the Middle East, particularly over the Sinai Peninsula. Operating from Egypt, Soviet crews conducted high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance flights that Israeli air defenses and fighters could not intercept. Surface-to-air missiles failed. F-4 Phantoms and Mirage-3 fighters failed. On at least one occasion, a MiG-25 reportedly exceeded Mach 3 while evading pursuit. These missions provided critical intelligence and demonstrated in real combat conditions the aircraft's unique survivability. They also contributed to the strategic balance that preceded the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Other variants expanded the aircraft's role further. The MiG-25RB combined reconnaissance with bombing capability, delivering weapons from extreme altitude and speed. Accuracy was limited, but in the nuclear age, precision was not always the priority. Later, the MiG-25BM was developed as a dedicated suppression aircraft, carrying anti-radiation missiles designed to hunt enemy radar systems, an early counterpart to Western platforms armed with weapons like the AGM-88 HARM. Exported MiG-25s saw service in multiple air forces, including Iraq, Libya, Syria, India, and Algeria. In Indian service, MiG-25 reconnaissance flights reportedly passed directly over sensitive areas at extreme speed, immune to interception and leaving a profound psychological impact. The aircraft's most intense combat experience came during the Iran-Iraq War. Iraqi MiG-25s achieved successes against Iranian aircraft, particularly earlier in the conflict. As Iran adapted, deploying its F-14 Tomcats more effectively, the balance shifted. Engagements became dangerous and costly for both sides. Still, many MiG-25s survived the long war, testament to their speed and the difficulty of engaging them on favorable terms. Their limits were exposed during the 1991 Gulf War. Facing overwhelming coalition air power, Iraqi MiG-25s could not alter the outcome. Most losses occurred on the ground, destroyed by airstrikes rather than air-to-air combat. By the time of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the remaining aircraft were relics, some reportedly buried in sand to avoid destruction. Back home, MiG-25s served quietly into the post-Soviet era. Some were used for specialized testing, others for training. A few played an unexpected role in the Soviet space program. Modified MiG-25s supported the Energia-Buran program, helping test systems and procedures for the reusable spacecraft. In 1988, MiG-25s accompanied the Buran shuttle during its fully automated orbital mission and return, one of the most remarkable technical achievements of the late Cold War. By the early 2000s, the MiG-25 had largely disappeared from frontline service. A few airframes lingered in secondary roles or foreign inventories, but its era was over. And that may be the most fitting conclusion of all. The MiG-25 was born from fear of altitude, fear of speed, fear of vulnerability. It answered those fears with steel, heat, and brute force engineering. In doing so, it made itself obsolete. By destroying the viability of high-altitude penetration, it erased the very threat it had been created to defeat. It was not elegant, it was not versatile, it was not forgiving, but it was honest. The MiG-25 arrived when it was needed, performed the task it was designed for, and stepped aside when the world moved on. Few weapon systems can claim such clarity of purpose. Fewer still can claim to have changed the rules of the game without ever firing a shot in anger against their intended enemy. In the end, the MiG-25 was not just a fast aircraft. It was the sound barrier's final warning.